Hi guys, how's it going? I'm just greetings from Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. I figured I'd do a quick little political ideology here and talk about the Cold War. On the left, the gentleman in the glasses, underneath Uncle or with Uncle Sam underneath him, that is Harry Truman, the president of the United States, who took over after FDR at the end of World War II. The guy on the right, the big bushy mustache, as you guys know, this is the one, the only Joseph Stalin. I'm going to be talking to you about the U.S. and USSR competing ideologies at the start of the Cold War, democracy versus communism. So here we go. First thing you need to know is how to figure out what ideology is. It's a system of ideas or ideals, especially one that formed on the basis of economic or political theory or policy. In this case, you look at democracy with President Truman underneath here. It was a government run by the people. Example here is the United States. On the flip side, you talk about communism, where everything the government owns, everything is like factories, land, and machines. It's an example of the USSR. So there's Joseph Stalin there as well. Okay, we talk about after World War II and how Stalin and the USSR dropped something called the metaphorical Iron Curtain. All right, Winston Churchill, a name that we had talked about before, came up with what was called the Iron Curtain speech, where he went ahead and talked about how Stalin was creating this Iron Curtain, which was a dividing line between the East and the West. The U.S. responded with something called the Truman Doctrine, and the Truman Doctrine was a doctrine that stated that the U.S. would fight communism in any country that required it. And we created something called the Marshall Plan to contain that. The Marshall Plan gave the United States the ability to send funds to any country in need of falling to communism, and we would help them out. Okay, Stalin closed the city of West Berlin, all right, to the rest of the world. He surrounded it with the Soviet troops. President Truman began what was called the Berlin Airlift, and it was where we were sending planes across from West Germany to West Berlin around the clock, and the world was watching and waiting to see. Stalin wanted all of Berlin, and the United States and its allies said, "No, I don't think so." So in the end, the Berlin Airlift was a huge success for the Allies. Okay, after World War II, the U.S. And its allies formed something called NATO, which was a North Atlantic Treaty Organization. If you look over here, United Kingdom, West Germany, Italy, Spain, and so on, Turkey. These are all countries that became part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And this was created to counter the active Soviet power in Europe because they felt that the Soviet power was becoming way too much. In response to this, the Soviet Union formed what was called the Warsaw Pact Alliance, which is all the countries over here, all right, in the East, the Soviet Union, Poland, and so on. Okay. From there, we talk about the Cold War and how it spread to Asia. One of the things that the United States wanted to do was rebuild Japan itself and create Japan as a new democracy in Asia itself. There was a revolution in China, and it was between the communists and the Democrats. The communists ended up winning, and a guy by the name of Mao Zedong, all right, ended up taking over China, which then the rest of the world started seeing this and becoming communist. Um, there was a war that happened in Korea. This was considered, quote unquote, a police action. All right. So what happened is Truman attempted to contain communism in Asia by defending South Korea itself. The UN and U.S. forces went there. They were led by General MacArthur. It was a seesaw battle. The North the North Koreans were doing well. The United States was being beaten. The U.S. was beating up on them, and then eventually the Chinese got involved, and we pushed the Chinese all the way back to where they needed to. And General MacArthur wanted to use nuclear weapons against the Chinese and say, we'll bring the Chinese down and end this conflict and be home by Christmas. Truman didn't like that, so he fired MacArthur because MacArthur continued to challenge him as president. The Korean War was fought to a stalemate. President Eisenhower ended the conflict in 1953, and they established the 38th parallel as a dividing line between the North and South, with the DMZ, which is called Demilitarized Zone, being there. At the end of this conflict, 54,000 Americans died overall. Not good for us on that end because American blood was spilt on foreign soil. Talk about the Cold War at home. There's anti-communist sentiment all throughout the world, and now it's started to sweep through the United States itself. The fear of communism grew here, and it was exploited by McCarthy. Okay, Senator Joseph McCarthy was a Republican from Wisconsin, and he played upon America's fears of communism. He accused American officials, celebrities, educators, writers, even U.S. members of being either communist or communist sympathizers. There were actresses like Lucille Ball who ended up getting drug into this. Political opinion in the end turned against him because his tactics and unsubstantiated charges began to offend the American public. Like everything, they got sick of it after a while. They're like, okay, we just want to go back to life as we know it. Okay, now you talk about Eisenhower. Truman leaves office. President Eisenhower comes in, being the former Supreme Allied Commander of forces during World War II, really helped him out. Ike takes on the policy of what you call massive retaliation against any Soviet aggression in Europe. He believed that it was something called MAD, mutually assured destruction, that if the Soviets attack the United States, we're attacking you, we will unload all our bombs, there will be no winner in the end. The Eisenhower Doctrine created, which called for the U.S. military to defend any Middle East countries against Soviet aggression. Eisenhower also got to the point where he sent advisors to Vietnam, fearing that the domino effect would happen in Asia. If this country falls to communism, then this country will fall, and so on. So that became our American policy of containment, was called the domino theory, and we use the Eisenhower Truman to defend whatever nations were in need of it. Okay, you talk about containment in Latin America with the Cold War. Castro took over in Cuba. The U.S. did not like this. They grew concerned about this becoming a communist nation and having Soviet influence. And they didn't like the fact that this was only 90 miles off the coast of the United States. So they created something called the Bay of Pigs invasion. Eisenhower supported the training of Cuban exiles to lead a revolt against Castro. When he left, Kennedy took over, and Kennedy actually carried out with the Bay of Pigs invasion, but he did not want to use U.S. air support to back them up. This ended up becoming a huge failure, and it became a great embarrassment to the Kennedy administration. The Soviets now felt that they could have their way with Kennedy. So now in November of 1962, roughly October, November, they create the Cuban Missile Crisis was created, and it almost led to war between the U.S. and USSR. We discovered that the USSR had been placing nuclear weapons in Cuba. Kennedy demanded that the USSR under Khrushchev remove all missiles. It got to the point where we created a quarantine, quote unquote, of Cuba for that time, and the U.S. blockade became very successful, and Khrushchev ended up backing down. But this was such an intense time during that whole month of October and November of 1962 that the people's fear was that we were getting ready to go to war. We had troop movements and so going on. Watch a movie if you get an opportunity called The Days of October with Kevin Costner, which is phenomenal, which talks about the whole Cuban Missile Crisis. As a result of the crisis, a hotline was created between the U.S. and USSR now, and any time that things would get heated between the two nations, the presidents could pick up the phone and call and say, hey, here's what's going on. We need to see about correcting this. Eventually, it got so bad in Europe that they saw people leaving the East for the West in massive numbers. So Khrushchev ordered the wall to be constructed in Berlin, between West Berlin and East Berlin. The Berlin Wall was constructed by the Soviets to prevent the escapes to freedom in the early 1960s. Again, something that happened during the Kennedy administration itself. But this wall then would stand until 1989, and it was brought down under the Reagan administration. And we'll talk about that with the end of communism. So as it stands, thank you for your time. You guys have a good day.